There are stories that find us when we least expect them, handed down through county records, through old letters tucked inside drawers, through the kind of quiet persistence that leaves no monument but somehow refuses to be forgotten. This is one of those stories. And we think, if you stay with us until the end, you'll understand exactly why we couldn't let it go. The morning Hazel Morrow turned 22, she had three things to her name: a wool coat with a missing button, a leather satchel, worn soft at the handles, and a small iron burnishing tool wrapped in a rag at the bottom of that satchel. The coat had been her mother's, the satchel she'd carried since she was 14. The tool had belonged to Edmund Price, the saddler, who taught her everything she knew about leather and silence, and the particular dignity of making something last. Edmund had died in January of 1887, in the back room of his shop in Harwick, Colorado, with his boots still on and his ledger still open. He had no children, no wife, no living kin that anyone could locate. What he had was a small leather-working shop on the edge of town, a reputation for honesty that stretched 40 miles in every direction, and a girl he'd taken on as an apprentice 8 years prior because, as he told the Reverend once, she's got patient hands, and that's rarer than silver. Hazel had come to Edmund at 14, after her father died of a fever, and her mother's brother, a man named Cornelius Fitch, took the family farm under a debt, claimed that none of the children fully understood. Her mother followed her father within a year, worn through by grief and the particular cruelty of losing a home and a husband in the same season. Hazel had two younger brothers who went to cousins in Nebraska. There was no cousin for Hazel. There was only Cornelius Fitch pointing at the road and saying, in a voice that carried no apology, that he couldn't be responsible for everyone. She walked 5 miles to Harwick with her satchel and knocked on the door of the saddlery because it was the first lit window she saw. Edmund opened the door, looked her over for about 4 seconds and said, "You eaten today?" She hadn't. He fed her salt pork and cornbread and let her sleep in the storeroom. And by the end of the week, they had a quiet, unspoken arrangement that neither of them ever bothered to formalize, because neither of them saw the need. For 8 years, Hazel learned. She learned how to skive leather to an even thinness without tearing it, how to saddle stitch with a waxed thread that would outlast the piece itself, how to read a hide for where it would hold and where it would give. Edmund didn't teach like a schoolmaster. He taught like a man who simply did his work and trusted that someone watching closely enough would absorb what mattered. Hazel watched closely. She also learned his filing system, his supplier contacts, his pricing methods, and the names of every rancher within 3 counties who owed him a repair and hadn't come back for it. She learned the smell of good oak bark tannage versus a cheap chrome shortcut. She learned which tools could be replaced and which ones couldn't. And the iron burnishing tool, the one she now carried in her satchel, was one that couldn't. Edmund had shaped the handle himself from a piece of Osage orange wood he'd carried from Missouri in 1861. He gave it to her the week before he died, when they both knew what was coming. "You'll need your own tools," he said. It was as close to a farewell as either of them managed. "We want you to picture something for a moment. You are 22 years old. The person who made a place for you in the world is gone. The business where you worked and slept and built every skill you possess belongs now, by some legal technicality that doesn't seem fair and probably isn't, to a creditor in Denver who has no interest in running a saddlery and every interest in liquidating it. The room where you kept your things has been cleared out for an estate assessment. And the only person in Harwick who might have spoken up for you, the Reverend who knew Edmund for 30 years, died 6 weeks after Edmund did, and the new Reverend doesn't know you from a stranger. What do you do?" Hazel spent 3 weeks trying to answer that question with something other than the road. She asked the bank about Edmund's accounts, politely, twice, and was told that the estate was in probate and she had no standing. She asked the creditor's representative, a small man named Aldous Greer, who came down from Denver, smelling of pomade, whether the tools and stock could be sold separately or had to go as a lot. He looked at her the way men like him looked at women who ask practical questions and said he'd make a note of her inquiry. She slept in the storeroom until Aldous Greer changed the lock. After that, she slept in the livery for 2 nights on the understanding that she'd mend a set of harnesses in exchange. Then the liveryman's wife decided she wasn't comfortable with the arrangement, and that was that. She had $4.60, a wool coat, a satchel, and Edmund's burnishing tool. She had also 8 years of knowledge that lived in her hands. The question was whether any of it was enough. The auction happened on a Thursday in late March, when the mud was deep and the sky was the color of old pewter. Aldous Greer had arranged for the saddlery's contents to be sold in lots: tools, leather stock, finished goods, fixtures. Hazel stood at the back of the small crowd and watched men she'd served for years buy things she'd helped maintain, and she kept her face as still as she could manage, which wasn't entirely still, but was still enough. After the equipment was sold, Greer moved on to a secondary list. Among the items was a small parcel of land Edmund had apparently acquired years before Hazel's time. 40 acres north of town, up on a plateau the locals called Garnet Bench, mostly pine and rock with a creek running through the lower third. There was a structure on it, Greer said, reading from his paper. A workshop of some kind. No road access to speak of. He seemed relieved to be getting to the end of his list. The bidding started at $12. There were 2 takers, neither of them serious. One dropped out at 15. The other made a face at 18 and shook his head. Hazel raised her hand. She didn't have $18. She had $4.60. But Aldous Greer hadn't gotten to her yet, and the gavel hadn't fallen. And there was something in her that refused to let that land go without at least trying. Greer looked at her with mild surprise. "Do I have 20? She said 22. It came out of her before she'd fully decided on it. Silence. Then Greer, apparently deciding that a bid was a bid, said 22. "Do I have 25? Nobody raised a hand. Sold. To the young lady in the back. Hazel walked home, except she didn't have a home, which was precisely the problem, and sat down in the churchyard on a stone that wasn't a bench but was flat enough. And she counted her money again, as though counting it differently might produce a different result. It didn't. She owed $22. She had $4.60. She had $17.40 to find before Aldous Greer came looking for the balance. She spent 2 days doing emergency repairs for every rancher within walking distance, charging half her usual rate to get the work fast, sleeping under a wagon canvas at the edge of the Beaumont ranch, because the widow Beaumont, a woman of around 60 named Jessamine, who had opinions about most things and a soft spot for competent women, told her the canvas was there if she needed it, and asked no questions. Hazel made $9 in 2 days, which she had not known was possible. She went back to Aldous Greer with $13.60. He looked at her money, looked at her face, and made a decision that she suspected had more to do with wanting to close out the estate and get back to Denver than with any generosity on his part. "Receipt of partial payment," he said, writing it out. "Balance of $8.40 due within 30 days, or the parcel reverts." She signed. Her hand was steadier than she expected. Now we should tell you what Hazel found when she got to Garnet Bench, because this is the part of the story that changes things. There was no road. There was a trail, barely, through the pine, the kind of trail a person makes by walking the same line enough times that the ground remembers. Hazel walked it with her satchel over one shoulder and her coat buttoned against the March wind. And after about 40 minutes of climbing, she came out onto the plateau and stopped. The structure was a workshop. That much was accurate. But it was a workshop built by someone who intended it to last, heavy-timbered, set into the hillside on 2 sides, so the rock served as foundation and wall both. The roof was cedar shake, weathered gray but intact. The door had a bar lock rather than a padlock, which meant it wasn't secured against someone who could reach through the gap and lift the bar, which Hazel could. She lifted the bar inside. Workbenches, hand-built, solid as anything she'd ever seen. Mounted tools on the walls, dusty but present. A draw knife, a set of chisels, a small spoke shave, 2 hand planes in different widths, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, 2 windows shuttered from inside, a sleeping loft above, accessible by a ladder built into the wall, and on the largest workbench, a wooden box. Hazel opened the box carefully. Inside the box were Edmund Price's survey notes for Garnet Bench. She had not known Edmund owned this land. She had not known he'd surveyed it himself, over what appeared to be several visits beginning around 1879. But there it was, in his careful, compressed handwriting. Notes on the creek's seasonal behavior, observations about the pine stands, and which were healthy and which were stressed by beetle. A rough map of the plateau, with the locations of seep springs marked. Notes about the soil quality in the lower meadow. An estimate of how many cords of wood could be sustainably harvested per year. And a running observation about the weather patterns that came off the mountain to the north, and how much earlier winter arrived on the bench compared to Harwick below. Edmund had been watching this land for almost 8 years, for almost exactly as long as Hazel had been working for him. At the bottom of the box was a single folded piece of paper. It was not a legal document. It was not a will. It was a letter, written in the same compressed hand, addressed to no one and everyone, which is the way some people write the things they can't quite say out loud. I have meant to do more with this place than I have managed, it began. A man makes plans, and then makes different plans, and then time has its say. What I know is that this bench is good land, and good land deserves someone who will pay attention to it. The tools and the notes are here for whoever has the patience to use them. I hope they find someone with patience. Patience is the thing. That was all. No signature, though it was obviously his. No instructions. Just that quiet, characteristic statement and the hope attached to it. Hazel sat down on the bench and read the letter 3 times. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, slow strokes. The creek she could hear but not see made its particular sound, the one moving water makes when it's running over smooth rock. A sound that is both restless and settled at once, if you can imagine how something can be both of those things. She thought she could make something work here. She was not certain, but she had survived 8 years on uncertain, and her hands knew what to do. The first 2 weeks on Garnet Bench were the hardest kind of hard. The kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but just keeps requiring more than you thought you had. Hazel had the structure, which was more than most people in her situation would have had. But the stove needed its pipe cleared. The water supply was a seep spring 20 yards uphill that ran clean but required carrying. And the sleeping loft had a mouse situation that required 2 days and a trap made from a tin can and a piece of rawhide before it was resolved. The workshop had tools but no materials, which meant she needed to get materials, which meant she needed money, which meant she needed to work, which meant she needed customers, which meant she needed people to know she existed up here on a plateau with no road. Edmund's survey notes became, in those first weeks, the most practical thing she owned. He had noted that the Beaumont Ranch used the lower trail as a shortcut to the north pasture, which meant Jessamine Beaumont knew about Garnet Bench. He had noted that the Krieger family. She'd met one of the Krieger boys at the auction, a quiet man named Thomas who'd bought a lot of bridal hardware, had a summer grazing operation within 2 miles of the plateau. He had noted that there was a mail route that passed within a mile of the bench trail on Tuesdays and Fridays, run by a man he referred to in the notes only as F. Marsh, who was apparently reliable. Hazel wrote notes on 3 scraps of leather, the only paper she had in any quantity, which was a statement about her life. Offering saddle repair and custom leatherwork, available at the Garnet Bench workshop, prices honest, work guaranteed. She left one with Jessamine Beaumont, who read it and said, without particular inflection, "You're serious then?" Hazel said she was. Jessamine looked at her for a moment, and then said she had a bridle that needed new cheek straps and a set of saddlebags that had been waiting 18 months for someone to relace the closure. She left the second note with the mail rider on Tuesday. His name was Frederick Marsh, and he had a face like a man who'd seen everything twice and found it acceptable both times. He said he'd make mention of it. She left the third note with Thomas Krieger, who received it with a nod and said his father had 2 saddles that needed restuffing. He seemed mildly surprised that the offer was coming from a woman, working out of a mountain workshop. But he didn't say so, which Hazel appreciated. By the end of the 3rd week, she had enough work to make the $8.40 that would clear her debt to Aldous Greer, and about $6 beyond that. She walked to Harwick on a Wednesday and paid off the balance. Greer wrote her a receipt for the full $22. He handed it to her with an air of mild bewilderment, as though he'd expected the situation to resolve differently. She folded the receipt and put it in her satchel, next to Edmund's letter, which she had begun to carry everywhere. She walked back to Garnet Bench in the afternoon light and sat outside the workshop door and watched the light do what it does to pine needles when the sun is coming in at a low angle, which is to say, something remarkable that has no good name. And she felt something that wasn't quite happiness, but was in the same family, the specific satisfaction of having a place that was hers because she had found it and worked for it and held on with both hands. We want to stop here for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever had a thing, a skill, a piece of knowledge, a way of seeing, that someone else gave you, maybe without even meaning to teach it? The kind of thing you only recognize as a gift years later, when you're standing somewhere difficult and you suddenly realize you know exactly what to do. Hazel didn't think of herself as someone who'd been given a gift. She thought of herself as someone who'd worked for what she knew, and she had. But the truth is both things can be true at the same time. You can work for something and also be given something, and the working doesn't erase the giving, and the giving doesn't erase the working. Edmund Price had given her 8 years of watching him. That was, in the end, what the burnishing tool represented. Not the tool itself, which was only iron and Osage orange wood, but everything she'd seen done by the hand that held it. She could feel that sometimes, working with it, the way muscle memory carries more than muscle, the way a tool worn to someone else's grip eventually accepts yours. We don't know if Edmund intended this. We think he probably intended less than people will want to believe, and more than he would ever have said out loud. The summer of 1887 on Garnet Bench was not easy, and we're not going to tell you it was. The workshop lacked equipment she needed: a proper stitching horse, a lasting table, a set of swivel knives in the smaller sizes. She improvised. The way you improvise when buying the right thing isn't an option. A sawbuck made from scrap pine stood in for the stitching horse, and it was uncomfortable and less efficient, and she used it every day. She ordered 2 swivel knives from a supplier in St. Louis that Edmund had used, sending a letter with half payment and explaining the situation with more candor than was probably wise. And the supplier, a man named Beckwith, who had apparently known Edmund for 20 years, sent the knives, charged her the other half at a 40% discount, and included a note that said simply, "Edmund spoke well of you. Make good work." She kept that note in the satchel too. By August, she had a steady rotation of 8 clients and had taken on 2 pieces of custom work: a rifle scabbard for a rancher's son who was heading to Wyoming, and a set of matching luggage straps for a woman in Harwick who was, she explained, very particular about such things. Hazel was also very particular about such things. They got along. Jessamine Beaumont rode up to the bench 3 times that summer, ostensibly to drop off work and collect finished pieces. The 3rd time, she also brought a half-wheel of cheese and a jar of pickled beets and sat down on the bench outside the workshop door and said, without any preamble, "You're making a go of it." "I think so," Hazel said. "Edmund was a good judge," Jessamine said, which was both a statement about Edmund and a statement about Hazel, and perhaps a statement about the nature of judgment in general. Then she ate some cheese and talked about the weather pattern coming off the North Mountain, which was almost exactly what Edmund had described in his survey notes. And Hazel thought about how knowledge repeats itself in a place, how the land teaches the same lessons to everyone who pays attention. The $8.40 that had once felt like a wall she couldn't see over was by September a memory, not a distant one. She wouldn't pretend the difficulty had been small, but a resolved one. The receipt was still in her satchel, and she was glad for it. It was the kind of thing you keep not because you'll need it, but because you want to have something that says, "I came through this. I have the paper that proves it." Cornelius Fitch came to Garnet Bench in October. We should have mentioned Cornelius earlier, but we wanted you to know Hazel first before we told you about him, because knowing who she was by October is different from knowing who she was in March, and the difference matters for what happened next. He came up the trail on a gray horse on a Tuesday afternoon, and Hazel saw him from the workshop door and recognized the set of his shoulders before she recognized his face. Because some people you know by how they carry themselves before anything else. Cornelius Fitch carried himself like a man accustomed to walking into places and having them rearrange around him. He was her mother's brother. He had taken the Morrow family farm 7 years ago under a debt claim that Hazel had never been able to fully investigate, because investigating required time and money and standing that she hadn't possessed at 14. He was not, she noticed, the kind of man who looked guilty. He looked like a man who had simply made practical decisions and was surprised to find them occasionally revisited. "Heard you set up out here," he said, dismounting. She didn't invite him in. "Heard Edmund Price left you the land." "No one left me anything," she said. "I bought it at auction." He nodded slowly, looking at the workshop, the plateau, the line of pines. She watched him calculate. "Be a good piece of land in the right hands," he said. "Creeks year-round?" "I'm working," she said. "If you need something repaired, I can look at the saddle. Otherwise." He turned back to her. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't entirely read, part surprise, part something older and less clean. "You've done well for yourself," he said, as though this required acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. "I have." He stood there for another moment. She stood in her workshop door with Edmund's burnishing tool in her hand, because she'd been mid-task when he arrived, and she didn't put it down. After a while, Cornelius Fitch got back on his gray horse. He didn't say anything else. He rode back down the trail through the pines, and she watched until the sound of the hoofbeats faded, and then she went back inside and finished the task. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She'd thought, at 14, that she'd feel something like triumph if she ever stood in a place like that with Cornelius Fitch. But what she actually felt was quieter than that. A kind of settledness, a sense of things resolved that didn't require celebration, because celebration is for people who weren't sure how it would go, and some part of her, by October, had known how it would go. She had paid attention. She had worked with patient hands. She had read every page of Edmund's notes, carried his tools carefully, maintained his suppliers, served his clients well, and built her own, slowly, one honest piece at a time. She had claimed a piece of land and paid for it, and made something on it that would last. Cornelius Fitch had walked onto her ground, looked it over, and walked away. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. The winter of 1887 arrived early on Garnet Bench, just as Edmund's notes had predicted it would. Snow came in the third week of November, heavy and even, covering the plateau in that particular silence that snow makes when it falls without wind. A silence that isn't quiet exactly, but is the opposite of loud, which is different. Hazel had prepared. She'd spent September and October laying in cordwood from the pine she'd carefully selected. Not the healthy trees, but the ones Edmund's notes had marked as stressed, the beetle kill already visible in the upper limbs, the ones she'd be doing the stand a service to remove. She'd preserved what meat she could, traded leatherwork for flour and salt, and dried beans with Jessamine Beaumont, who exchanged goods the way some people exchange currency, practically and without sentiment. She'd banked the workshop walls with sod on the north and west sides, the way Edmund's note suggested. And the difference in draft was noticeable within the first cold week. She worked through December and January by lamplight, which made certain detailed tasks harder and made her appreciate Edmund's preference for south-facing windows more than she had before. She made mistakes she hadn't made before. Small ones, the kind that cold and low light conspire to produce. She noted them in a journal she had started keeping. Not because Edmund had kept one, or not only because of that, but because she found that writing down what she'd done wrong was the fastest way to stop doing it. The creek did not freeze. Edmund had noted it probably wouldn't, being spring-fed, and he had been right, which was one of the particular comforts of those months, trusting the notes, finding them accurate, feeling the accumulated attention of a dead man serve as company of a kind. By February, the work had slowed, as it always does in deep winter when people stay close to their own fires. She used the time to work on pieces she didn't have clients for yet. A pair of saddlebags to her own design, with an improvement to the closure mechanism that she'd been thinking through since October. A belt with a hand-tooled pattern of pine branches that she made for no reason, except that she wanted to see whether she could manage the technique, and she could. She made careful notes on both. She was not lonely in any way she didn't know how to handle. She had always been comfortable with her own company, which is something Edmund had recognized in her from the first week. Most people think silence is empty, he had said once, not to her specifically, but in a way she was meant to hear. Turns out there's a lot in it. In March of 1888, almost exactly 1 year after she had stood in the mud at the back of an auction crowd with $4.60 and raised her hand, Hazel Morrow filed a formal deed registration for the 40 acres on Garnet Bench with the county clerk in Harwick. She had gone to some trouble to understand the relevant law, had consulted a lawyer in town named Mr. Alderman who had charged her $2 for 20 minutes and had confirmed what she'd already reasoned out. The receipt of partial payment, the receipt of full payment, and the transfer of auction sale were sufficient, but registration protected her from any future challenge. She filed the registration. The clerk, a young man with ink on his fingers who seemed mildly impressed that the documentation was in good order, stamped it and handed her the copy. She folded it and put it in her satchel. She had in the satchel now Edmund's letter, her receipt for $22, her supplier correspondence from Beckwith, the deed registration, and the burnishing tool wrapped in its rag. She walked out of the county clerk's office into the March light and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk with the smell of mud and wood smoke and spring in the air. And she thought about the version of herself who had stood at that auction a year ago, cold, uncertain, $4.60 in her pocket, about to do something that made no practical sense. And she thought, Edmund would have understood that. He always said that some decisions aren't practical. They're just true. She walked back up the trail to Garnet Bench. The creek was running high with snowmelt, making that sound it makes over smooth rock, restless and settled, both at once. The workshop door was the way she'd left it, barred from inside, which meant she went around to the window she kept unlatched for exactly this purpose. She lifted the bar, let herself in, and started the stove. She had work to do. We'll leave Hazel there, in her workshop on the bench, with the stove warming and the light coming through the south-facing windows and the burnishing tool worn smooth in her hand. Not because the story ends there. It doesn't, not really. People's stories don't end the way chapters do, but because that's the moment that holds everything. She had not been given a rescue. She had not been handed an inheritance. She had shown up to an auction with almost nothing, paid attention to what a dead man had left in a wooden box, and built something with her own hands, in her own time, on her own terms. Edmund Price didn't save her. She took what he'd taught her, and she saved herself. We find ourselves thinking about that a lot. About the things we've been handed by people who are gone now. The skills, and the knowledge, and the particular ways of seeing that live in our hands and our eyes, without us always knowing where they came from. About whether we're using them. About whether we're paying the kind of attention that deserves to be passed on. What about you? Is there something someone gave you? A skill, a way of working, a pair of eyes for a thing, that you're still carrying? We'd love to know. Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to stay with us for the next story. We think you'll want to hear it.